My son slapped me across the face on Thanksgiving night, right in front of the turkey and silverware, and the only thing I did was smile. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I suddenly understood the truth. He thought my years of sacrifice were his to erase. Greed had poisoned him, pride blinded him, and envy turned him against me. I had given him everything, my money, my health, my life, and he repaid me with violence. But what he didn't know was that my silence, my smile, was not surrender. It was the beginning of something he would never see coming. The smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the small house, weaving through every corner as I moved back and forth between the kitchen and dining room. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged the silverware, not from age, but from the weight of memory. For weeks I had planned this dinner, not just as a holiday tradition, but as a reminder that, despite everything, family could still mean something. Every dish was deliberate. Every flavor a story of sacrifice. The stuffing was the same recipe I had cooked when Michael was a boy, begging for second helpings with wide eyes. The cranberry sauce was made from scratch, the way my late mother once showed me, long before life had turned so complicated. As I basted the turkey, my mind wandered back to the nights when my body nearly gave out under fluorescent lights at the diner. Working double shifts, so Michael would never feel hunger the way I once did. I remembered the years I took in sewing jobs, stitching wedding dresses and uniforms, just to cover his textbooks and sports fees. Each dollar saved meant another dream of mine postponed, another piece of myself tucked away. But I never questioned it. I told myself that love was measured in labor, and that one day my son would see it. I wiped my hands on my apron and looked at the table again. 8 plates, 8 forks. It felt almost extravagant, though only a handful of people would sit there. I imagined laughter, Michael raising a glass, perhaps even a thank you whispered my way. That thought alone was enough to keep my tired legs moving. Michael arrived first, his wife and children in tow. The kids rushed past me, chasing each other into the living room, leaving a trail of coats and shoes. I didn't mind. Their laughter was a kind of music. Michael gave me a quick hug, distracted, his phone buzzing in his pocket. He looked older than I remembered, his jaw tighter, his hairline receding just slightly. Yet when I looked at him, all I could see was the little boy who once fell asleep on my lap after school. "Smells great, Mom," he said flatly, already half-turned toward his wife. I smiled anyway. "It's all your favorites." We sat down, the table glowing with candlelight, plates piled high. The conversation was surface level at first, work updates, school projects, the kind of chatter that fills silence, but means nothing. I watched Michael more than I listened, searching his face for some sign of warmth, some flicker of gratitude. He didn't meet my eyes. For a moment, I let myself drift. I imagined William, my late husband, sitting at the head of the table like he used to. He had been the steady one, the one who believed our love would be enough to shield us from Richard's shadow. But William was gone, and Richard was not. Even in memory, I could hear William's voice. "Don't ever let them take away what you've built, Evelyn." I cut into the turkey, passing slices around the table, my hands steady though my chest felt heavy. This dinner was more than food. It was my silent offering, my quiet plea for recognition. I didn't need speeches or applause. I only needed Michael to see me, to see all the invisible years that had carried him here. The doorbell rang just as I raised my glass. I froze, knife in hand, as Michael's wife hurried to answer it. The children fell quiet, sensing something, and then he stepped in. Richard. His presence filled the room like smoke, unwelcome and suffocating. He wore that same smug smile I remembered from the divorce hearings, the same calculating eyes that once looked at me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. He had not been invited. He should not have been here. "Happy Thanksgiving," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an edge that only I seemed to hear. I thought I'd stop by, see the family. The word family twisted in my ears like a knife. Michael's eyes flickered with uncertainty before softening, almost as if he welcomed his father's intrusion. My stomach dropped. Richard stepped closer, clapping Michael on the shoulder with practiced familiarity. He bent down, his lips nearly brushing my son's ear. His whisper was too low for me to catch, but I saw Michael's jaw tighten. Something unspoken passed between them, something dark. Richard leaned back, his grin wider now, like a man who had just won a bet. I looked around the table, my hands suddenly cold despite the heat from the kitchen. The turkey, the candles, the laughter I had dreamed of, it all felt fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter it completely. I forced myself to smile, though inside I was trembling. I had prepared this feast as a quiet celebration of love, a reminder of my devotion. But as Richard settled into a chair uninvited, as Michael avoided my gaze, I knew the night was no longer mine. The air grew heavy, every second stretching, the scent of roasted turkey turning bitter in my nose. I set down my fork, my knuckles white. Something was coming. I could feel it crawling at the edges of the evening. I told myself to breathe, to endure just a little longer. But deep down, I already knew. This Thanksgiving would not be remembered for the meal I cooked, but for the moment Richard's poison began to spill, turning the son I had given everything for into a stranger across the table. Richard leaned in close, his lips nearly brushing Michael's ear, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. I could only catch fragments, but I knew his rhythm, the cadence of poison disguised as truth. Your mother keeps everything locked away, the house, the savings. She's never trusted you. To her, you're just a pawn, nothing more. You think all her sacrifices were for you? No, Michael. They were for control. I watched Michael's shoulders tense, his hand gripping the edge of the table. My chest tightened as I saw the storm gathering in his eyes. He didn't look at me. He didn't ask. He simply absorbed Richard's venom like dry soil taking in rain. Michael? I started softly, my voice trembling. Why don't we? But before I could finish, his hand shot up, fast and unthinking. The slap landed sharp across my face, a burst of pain that rang louder than any shout could. My head snapped to the side, the taste of copper filling my mouth. For a moment, I didn't breathe. The room went silent. Forks froze mid-air, glasses hung suspended, even the children's giggles evaporated into stunned quiet. The golden light of the chandelier seemed suddenly cold, its glow no longer warm but harsh, exposing every crack in our fragile family. I pressed my palm against my cheek, the sting burning deep, but what hurt more was the realization in his eyes. He didn't look sorry. He looked convinced. Richard sat back, smirking, as if this was the inevitable conclusion of his whispered prophecy. Michael's wife shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between us, but her lips sealed tight. No one spoke. No one defended me. I was alone, though I was surrounded by blood and kin. And in that moment, I did the only thing I could. I smiled. It wasn't wide or triumphant, just a small, steady curve of my lips, the kind of smile that made people question what I knew, what I held back. My voice was calm, low but clear enough to slice through the silence. "Thank you," I said. Michael froze, his hand still trembling from the strike, his brow furrowed, confusion clouding his anger. This wasn't the reaction he expected. He wanted tears, a protest, maybe even rage. But gratitude? That unsettled him more than any outburst could. Richard's smirk faltered for half a second, then returned, though tighter now, as if even he wasn't sure what game I was playing. The children shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing something adults refused to name. My granddaughter clutched her fork, her eyes wide and questioning, as if silently asking me why I wasn't fighting back. I turned to her briefly, offering the smallest nod, before looking back at my son. My cheek throbbed, my ears rang, but inside, something strange was settling. Not peace, never peace, but clarity. I had spent decades giving, pouring everything I had into Michael. Every hour of labor, every dollar earned, every piece of myself had been funneled into his future. And now, here he was, raised not just by my sacrifices, but by my silence, ready to strike me down because another man's whisper told him to. "Thank you," I repeated, this time softer. Almost a whisper, meant for myself. Michael blinked, his chest rising and falling as if he'd been running. "What do you mean?" he snapped, though his voice cracked, betraying doubt. I didn't answer. I let the question hang in the air, twisting, gnawing at him. My silence, my smile, they became weapons sharper than any blade. He searched my eyes for weakness and found none, only an unsettling calm. Richard leaned back, lifting his glass with mocking ease. "Well," he said, his voice smooth and oily, "looks like we've all learned something tonight." But even he shifted in his chair, uneasy, because he knew, somewhere deep down, that gratitude in the face of humiliation is not surrender. It's a sign of something stronger, something hidden. The rest of the meal was abandoned. Plates of turkey grew cold, gravy congealed, candles flickered against the stillness. No one dared touch their food. No one dared speak to me. I stood quietly, folded my napkin, and placed it on the table with steady hands. "I should be going," I said softly, though no one asked me to stay. Michael opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. He looked at me with a mix of confusion and fear, unable to reconcile the woman he thought powerless with the one who smiled after a slap. I gathered my coat, each movement deliberate, refusing to let my hands shake. As I buttoned it, I glanced once more at Richard. His smirk was still there, but his eyes narrowed, calculating. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had turned Michael fully to his side. But my smile unsettled him. He didn't know why. Not yet. I walked out into the cold night, the sting on my cheek still fresh, but my resolve even fresher. Behind me, the golden lights of the house glowed like a cage I had just stepped out of. And for the first time in years, I felt strangely free. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was that my silence tonight was not the end. It was the beginning. The night I left that house, I didn't look back. The sting on my cheek had faded to a dull ache, but the wound inside was sharp, fresh, and deeper than any slap could cut. I walked down the quiet street with my coat buttoned to my throat, the air bitter and damp. Behind me, the windows glowed warmly, but that glow wasn't mine anymore. It never had been. By morning, I had packed the essentials into a single suitcase. A few clothes, my mother's recipe book, a framed photo of Michael as a boy, smiling in the sun with ice cream dripping down his chin. That smile had carried me through years of exhaustion. Now, even that picture felt like a relic from another lifetime. I rented a small apartment above a laundromat on the edge of town. The walls were thin, the pipes clanged at night, and the paint peeled in corners. But it was mine. No rules, no whispers, no raised hands, just silence. The days blurred quickly. I cooked simple meals, mostly soup, broth, simmering quietly on the stove while I sat at the table alone. The chair across from me stayed empty, and in its emptiness, I saw the shape of what my life had become. I hung the family photos on the wall, though the glass was scratched and the images had faded. They didn't comfort me anymore. They reminded me of how easily I could be erased from the very story I had built. Michael didn't call. He didn't come. Not once. Days passed, then weeks. The only sound of his life reaching me was the occasional headline about his work, a new deal, a photo of him shaking hands with some investor. To him, I was already gone. Maybe that slap wasn't just an outburst. It was the seal of erasure. Richard, I was told, laughed openly when my name came up among mutual acquaintances. "She's out of the way now," he said. "One less piece on the board." The words reached me like smoke seeping under a door, poisonous but expected. That was always his game, to see people as pieces, to play them until they broke. And I had broken, hadn't I? That's what he wanted them all to believe. I tried to fill my evenings with something: books, puzzles, the occasional TV show. But none of it quieted the hollow inside. The silence pressed in too heavily. There were nights I sat at the table with soup untouched, staring at the faded photo of Michael and wondering where I had lost him. Was it in the years I worked too many shifts? The birthdays I missed because I was too tired to bake a cake? Or was it simply the lure of Richard's lies, promising him something I could never give? The loneliness grew sharp, but there was also a strange clarity in it. Without anyone else's expectations, I began to hear my own thoughts again. Painful, yes, but honest. One afternoon, as the November wind rattled the thin windows, I found an envelope in my mailbox. It was thick, heavier than any bill or flyer, sealed with neat handwriting I hadn't seen in years. My stomach tightened the moment I saw the return address: Harper and Gold, attorneys at law. That name was a ghost. They had been William's lawyers, my late husband, the man who had built a life with me before Richard tore it apart. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed at the edges, but the ink still bold. "Mrs. Carter," it began, formal but steady. "Enclosed, please find documents retained in our office by your late husband, William Carter. These materials were never claimed, but we believe you should have them now." I read the words again and again, my pulse hammering. Beneath the letter was a bundle of papers, tied neatly with string. I carried them to the table and sat down slowly, my chair creaking under the weight of what I was about to open. For a long moment, I just stared at the bundle. The apartment around me was quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the faint clang of pipes upstairs. My fingers itched to untie the knot, but part of me hesitated. What could William possibly have left behind? He'd been gone so long. Would it matter now? Would it change anything? I reached for my soup, now cold, and set it aside untouched. My hands hovered over the knot again, and then I pulled. The string fell loose, and the papers unfolded onto the table, spilling secrets across the wood. What I saw made me gasp. The papers spread across the table like fragments of a forgotten life. My hands shook as I skimmed the first page. William's name at the top in bold, his signature etched in steady lines at the bottom. It was a will, dated years before his death, carefully drafted and legally bound. My breath caught as the words unfolded. He had left the house, the savings, everything we had built together, solely in my name. No loopholes, no shared claim, no door left open for Richard to creep through. My chest tightened as I realized the truth. All this time, Richard had whispered to Michael about a house that was never his to take. Every cruel word, every manipulative glance across the Thanksgiving table had been built on lies. Lies that William had already seen coming and had guarded against long before his heart gave out. I pressed my palm against the page, closing my eyes. For the first time in years, I felt William with me, not in memory alone, but in action. He had left me a shield, even after death. He had known Richard's nature too well, and he had tried, in his quiet way, to protect me from the storm he feared would one day arrive. The tears came quickly, hot and unrelenting, but they weren't the tears of defeat I had shed so many times before. They were tears of recognition, of knowing I hadn't been abandoned entirely. Someone had believed in me. Someone had seen my worth, even when the world chose to erase it. As I wiped my cheeks, another envelope slipped from between the documents. Smaller, lighter. I tore it open with trembling fingers, expecting more legal jargon. But what fell into my hand was a folded piece of construction paper, decorated in bright crayon colors. My heart stuttered when I read the uneven letters scrawled across the front. For Grandma. Inside was a child's drawing. 2 figures holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. One was taller, with gray scribbles for hair, the other a small girl with wide eyes and messy curls. Above their heads in shaky writing were the words, "Grandma, I believe you." I pressed the picture to my chest and broke. The sobs came hard, wrenching, my body curling over the table as if the little girl's hand in the drawing could reach through the paper and touch me. My granddaughter, my sweet, innocent granddaughter, saw me. She believed me, even if her father didn't, even if no one else at that cursed dinner table did. I pinned the drawing to the wall above the faded family photos. For the first time in weeks, the apartment didn't feel so empty. A child's belief had filled it with a light stronger than any candle. As the hours passed, I stared at the will, the drawing, the tangled history spread across my table. Something hardened in me. Not bitterness, not rage, but clarity. I understood then that I didn't need Michael's recognition or Richard's approval or anyone else's validation. My worth was not up for debate. It had never been theirs to grant or deny. All those years of sacrifice, the broken nights and weary mornings had meaning because I gave them, not because anyone acknowledged them. My life was not a bargain for gratitude. It was my story, and I had allowed others to hold the pen for too long. I stood, fetched the small leather-bound notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer, a gift from William many years ago. Its pages were still mostly blank, waiting. I set it down, uncapped a pen, and pressed the tip firmly against the paper. For a moment I hesitated, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic outside. The silence was thick, but it no longer suffocated me. It steadied me. Then I wrote, "I will not beg. I will rebuild." The words looked stark against the white page, but they pulsed with something fierce, something alive. I underlined them once, twice, carving them into permanence. It was not a declaration for anyone else to read. It was a promise to myself, the first step of a journey I had long postponed. I closed the notebook gently, sliding my hand across its cover as though sealing an oath. In the reflection of the window, I caught my own eyes. They were swollen from tears, rimmed in red, but there was a fire in them I hadn't seen in years, a fire that whispered that everything Richard thought he had stolen, everything Michael thought he had erased, was still mine, and they would never see me coming. I had written the words, "I will not beg. I will rebuild," and for the first time in decades, I believed them. The will had confirmed my security. The drawing from my granddaughter had confirmed my worth. What came next was up to me. I wasn't going to let my life shrink into silence and soup bowls eaten alone. If I was going to survive, I would survive with purpose. I sold off what remained of my savings, a modest sum that most would have considered too small to start anything meaningful. But I had lived on little before, and I knew how to stretch every penny. With that money, I rented a dusty storefront on the corner of Maple and 3rd, a forgotten place with peeling paint and broken windows. Neighbors called it a lost cause. To me, it was a seed. I scrubbed those floors myself, painted the walls a soft cream, and installed second-hand tables I'd scavenged from yard sales. The first night I turned the key and saw the space glow under the new lights, I whispered to William, "We're starting again, love." I called it the hearth. It wasn't just a kitchen. It was a refuge. My idea was simple. One hot meal, free or cheap, for anyone who needed it, especially the elderly left alone, those who shuffled through winters with empty cupboards and colder hearts. The first week, only 2 people came. Mrs. Green, a widow from down the block, and an old veteran named Hank, who had been living on canned beans. We sat together at one table, eating stew I'd made from scratch, and for the first time in months my laughter felt real. By the end of that month, word had spread. The hearth began to fill each evening. It wasn't the food that drew them. Not really. It was the way I looked at them when they spoke, the way I remembered their names, the way I said, "I'm glad you're here." People came back because they felt seen, because they felt heard. And in giving that to them, I found something for myself that I had lost long ago. I kept William's will safe in my apartment, tucked in a locked drawer, while my notebook became my constant companion. Each night, after the last chair was stacked and the lights turned off, I wrote in it. Reflections, recipes, fragments of dreams. Some nights I wrote about Michael, but less and less with sorrow and more with distance. His silence no longer carved me open. It only reminded me of what I no longer needed. Meanwhile, far across town, Michael and Richard faced storms of their own. The business deal Richard had lured Michael into began to crumble, debts piling higher than profits. Investors withdrew, rumors spread. Michael's wife grew restless, the tension bleeding into their home. Richard kept promising salvation, pointing always toward the house, the property he swore would secure their future. But when the papers were finally checked, when lawyers confirmed the title, Richard's fury was volcanic. The house was mine, untouchable. William had insured it, and in a final twist, I had quietly transferred its standing into a protective trust for the hearth. No one could seize it now, not Richard, not Michael, not a single greedy hand. Every lie Richard had told collapsed under the weight of one man's foresight and one woman's quiet resolve. I didn't know all of this in detail at the time. Whispers reached me through neighbors and the local grapevine, but I could sense it. For once their world was unraveling while mine was slowly stitching itself back together. The symmetry was not lost on me. One snowy evening, after a long day serving stew and cornbread to a full room, I returned home, exhausted, but fulfilled. I dropped into my chair, turned on the television for background noise, and nearly dropped my mug when I saw my own face on the screen. It was the local news. A reporter was standing outside the hearth, describing it as a beacon of warmth in the community. Footage showed me ladling soup, hugging Mrs. Green, laughing with Hank. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Evelyn Carter, the soul of Thanksgiving." I sat frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The words echoed through the room, louder than the applause at any banquet, stronger than any thanks I had ever waited for from Michael. Recognition had found me, but not in the way I once craved. Not from the ones who had denied me, but from strangers who had become my family. Across town, I imagined Michael seeing it too, the screen glowing in his living room, my name spelled out for the world to witness. I pictured his stunned face, his disbelief, his dawning realization that I had not been erased at all, that I had risen higher than he ever expected, without him, without his gratitude, without his permission. And for the first time since that slap, I smiled not as a defense, not as a mask, but as a truth. The snow had melted into slush by the time the town gathered for its annual winter charity fair. Stalls lined the square, strung with twinkling lights, the air filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon. I stood at the center, ladling soup from a steaming pot, surrounded by laughter and chatter. My apron was flour-dusted, my hands tired, but my heart was light. Around me were faces I had once served in silence, neighbors, widows, veterans, forgotten souls, now calling me by name, now calling me family. "Evelyn, this is delicious," Mrs. Green said, clutching her bowl with both hands. Hank raised his cup in salute, grinning beneath his wool cap. Children darted past, one pausing to hug my waist before running off again. I laughed, the sound rising above the winter air. For once, I was not the ghost in the room. I was the warmth at its center. Across the square, hidden in the crowd, Michael stood watching. His coat collar was turned up, his breath visible in the cold, but the frost on his face came from something deeper than weather. His eyes locked on me, wide with disbelief. He had expected me to vanish, to wither after that night. Instead, he saw me radiant, stronger, surrounded by a family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. I felt his gaze before I saw him. Some instinct, some pull of motherhood made me turn. For a fraction of a second, our eyes met. The boy I once cradled, the man who had struck me, stood frozen, his lips parted as though he might speak. I watched the battle inside him, the words struggling at his throat. Mom. But the sound never came. It withered before it reached the air. His pride, his shame, his fear, they built a wall that no single word could climb. His hand lifted half an inch, then fell again. He looked smaller than I remembered, lost in a crowd that no longer belonged to him. I turned back to the pot, stirring slowly, my smile steady. Not cruel, not mocking, simply unbending. He had made his choice, and I had made mine. Somewhere in the shadows, Richard was absent. Word had spread of his financial collapse, of investors abandoning him, of his schemes unraveling thread by thread. Bitter and beaten, he had disappeared from public view, leaving behind only debts and curses. His voice no longer whispered in Michael's ear. His shadow no longer stretched over my life. The fair continued, music drifting through the air, bells ringing from the church tower. I moved from table to table, serving, laughing, listening. These people didn't need to know the details of what I had endured. They only knew that I showed up, that I fed them, that I saw them when no one else did. And in their eyes, I was more than a survivor. I was the soul of something greater than myself. At one point, I glanced back toward where Michael had been. The spot was empty now, the crowd swallowing him whole. Maybe he had left. Maybe he couldn't bear to stay. A pang flickered in my chest, but it was brief. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his return. My life no longer hinged on the recognition of the one who had denied me. I carried a tray of bread to a group of children sitting cross-legged by the fire pit. One of them, a little girl with bright eyes, tugged at my sleeve. "Miss Evelyn, are you always this happy?" she asked. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not always," I said honestly. "But happiness isn't something you wait for. It's something you build." She nodded as though she understood, and I felt something shift, a reminder that what I was building here would outlast me. It would ripple through others long after I was gone. Later that night, when the fair began to close, I stepped away from the bustle and looked at the lights strung across the square. My reflection shone faintly in a shop window, older now, lined with age, but unbroken. My smile was faint, but real, carved from every wound I had survived. And then for the first time, I let myself think of the slap, the sound of it, the sting of it, how the room had gone still, how I had smiled instead of wept. That smile had not been weakness, as they thought. It had been the seed of everything that followed. I turned slightly, as if speaking to someone unseen, as if the crowd of strangers and friends weren't enough. My voice was quiet but steady, carrying into the cold night. Have you ever been erased by the very people you raised? If you have, you know my smile was never weakness. It was my quiet revenge,